He didn't ask for much. Never had. At 76, Harold T. Merriweather walked with the quiet dignity of someone who had spent a lifetime earning respect, not demanding it. His knees ached more these days, but his posture remained proud. A brown cardigan draped over his shoulders, slacks freshly pressed, and on his head a Navy veteran cap, its faded gold stitching a quiet reminder of service long past. Harold waited patiently at Gate 6 of the Middle Georgia Regional Airport, gripping his boarding pass in one hand and the handle of a worn black suitcase in the other. He wasn't headed on vacation. He was flying to Colorado Springs to meet someone very special, his newborn great-grandson. His granddaughter Rhonda had called just a week ago, her voice trembling with emotion. "Papa," she had said, "I want you to be the first to hold him after me. You're the reason I made it through everything." That was all it took. Harold booked the ticket that very night. As he stepped onto the plane for Flight 228, he offered a polite nod to the attendant greeting passengers with scripted cheer. Harold didn't fake smiles. Not because he was unkind. He just didn't see the point in pretending. Seat 12B aisle. Just the way he liked it. He stored his carry-on overhead, slid into his seat with a quiet exhale, and pulled out an old paperback from his coat pocket. The title had long since worn off. He didn't need it. He knew the story by heart. The window seat beside him was occupied by a teenage girl glued to her phone. The middle seat remained empty. Perfect. But that peace was short-lived. Less than 5 minutes later, a younger flight attendant approached. Clipboard in hand, her ponytail pulled back so tightly it looked like it might snap. "Sir," she said, voice polite but tense, "I need to ask you to move. There's been a last-minute seat change." Harold looked up, confused. "But I'm in 12B. That's what's on my ticket." "Yes, I understand," she said quickly, "but we've had a reassignment. Would you mind moving to a seat in the back?" Harold blinked. "Is there something wrong with this one?" She hesitated just a second too long. "No, nothing wrong. Just a reassignment. We appreciate your cooperation." Around him, passengers had suddenly gone quiet. No one spoke up. No one asked questions. A man in 14A watched closely, brow furrowed, but Harold simply nodded and stood. "All right, no problem." He reached for his bag, but she stopped him. "You can leave that overhead. We'll bring it to you." "Is that necessary?" "It's just easier, sir." She led him down the aisle back toward the rear of the plane. As they passed row 12, another attendant was helping a well-dressed man settle into Harold's seat. He looked annoyed, like he'd paid for comfort and wouldn't be denied it. Harold didn't say a word. They reached the last row. "Right here, 31E, the attendant gestured. This seat was next to the lavatory. The air felt heavier. No one greeted him. He placed his book on the tray table, leaned back and stared at the ceiling. He wasn't angry, just tired. Tired of moments like this, where people chose not to see him. A few rows up, the man from 14A leaned toward the woman next to him. "Did you see that?" he whispered. She didn't even give him a reason. "He had that seat," the woman muttered. "That was his." The man, Thomas Gaines, narrowed his eyes. Something didn't sit right. Back in 31E, Harold folded his jacket neatly across his lap. That jacket had been with him through weddings, funerals, graduations. He didn't want it wrinkled, not even now. He tried not to notice the flashing lavatory sign just a few feet away or the toddler crying 2 seats down. He reached for his book again, but didn't open it. Instead, he stared at the back of the seat in front of him, like it might offer him an explanation. Up in 12B, the new occupant, a man in a tailored blazer with noise-canceling headphones, was already sipping bottled water and scrolling through his phone. The young flight attendant checked on him twice. She never looked back at Harold. Thomas Gaines had seen enough. He pressed the call button. The same flight attendant appeared. "Yes, sir?" "I'm trying to understand," Thomas said. "That man, he had this seat. Why was he moved?" Her smile was mechanical. "There was a last-minute change, sir." "What kind of change?" "I'm not at liberty to share passenger details. We do our best to accommodate everyone." "But he had the seat, and you gave it to that guy." She didn't flinch. "I'm afraid that's all I can say." She turned and walked away. The engines began to hum. A voice came over the intercom. "Welcome aboard Flight 228 to Colorado Springs. Estimated flight time, 3 hours and 15 minutes. Harold didn't hear it. He sat quietly, eyes on the window. Not bitter, never bitter. But he remembered. A bus in Montgomery, 1964. A hospital waiting room where no one would speak to him. Standing in uniform and still being overlooked. It hadn't broken him then, and it wouldn't now. But it stayed with him. In the cockpit, Captain Roy Delaney reviewed the manifest. One note caught his eye. Former Navy vet, Cap, moved from 12B. He frowned. That wasn't standard procedure. Veterans were supposed to be given priority, not pushed aside. Back in row 31, Harold finally opened his book. The words blurred. His story had already been written long before this flight, but someone else on board had just realized Harold wasn't just another old man in a cap, and they weren't about to let it go. Captain Roy Delaney had seen a lot over his years in the sky. Belligerent passengers, entitled first-class flyers, even a golden retriever that had to be zip-tied to its crate after getting a little too excited mid-flight. But this was different. Before takeoff, he'd noticed the older gentleman being quietly moved from row 12. Something about it didn't sit right. After the cabin door closed, he had asked the gate crew about the reassignment. They waved it off casually, a last-minute adjustment, some clerical error. Nothing unusual, they said, already tapping away at their final reports. But Roy Delaney had a nose for half-truths, and this one reeked of it. Now cruising high above the clouds at 34,000 feet, Captain Delaney sat still in the cockpit, but his mind was in the cabin. He turned to glance down the aisle through the small opening behind the cockpit door. He could just make out the older man, Harold, sitting back near the lavatory in row 31. Alone, staring out a window, not reading, not napping, just still. It wasn't anger in Harold's face. It was something deeper, a kind of tiredness that didn't come from delayed flights or cramped legs. It came from being ignored, from being invisible, and Delaney had seen enough. He reached for the intercom. His voice was calm, but it carried the unmistakable weight of a man who meant every word. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've reached cruising altitude, and I'll be asking the crew to pause service for just a moment. There's something I need to address personally. A ripple of confusion swept through the cabin. People exchanged glances. One child leaned toward her mother and asked, "Did something break?" In row 14, Thomas Gaines looked back toward the rear of the plane. He knew exactly who this was about. In the cockpit, the door unlocked with a soft click and opened fully. Captain Roy Delaney stepped out, not in a hurry, not with drama, but with purpose. He moved steadily down the aisle. A flight attendant instinctively moved aside. Eyes followed him. Passengers paused their movies. Conversations died out. In row 12, the well-dressed man who had taken Harold's seat looked up, puzzled, then mildly irritated. But Delaney didn't stop. He walked past row 20, then 24, then 28, and finally row 31. He stopped. Harold looked up, startled. The captain met his gaze and didn't look away. He didn't say a word. Not yet. Instead, Delaney raised his right hand. A crisp, practiced salute. Sharp, unwavering, deeply personal. Harold blinked, stunned. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then slowly, his hand rose too, reflexively. It wasn't ceremony, it was recognition, respect. A silent language spoken between two men who had both once worn the same uniform. And then Delaney spoke, quietly but clearly enough for all nearby to hear. Mr. Harold Merriweather served 3 tours in Vietnam. In 1970, he pulled 6 men from a burning tent in Da Nang. That man sitting here has more courage in his bones than most of us will see in a lifetime. The cabin went silent. Then a single pair of hands clapped. Then another, and another, until the plane erupted into applause. A woman near Harold wiped tears from her eyes. The ponytailed flight attendant stood frozen by the beverage cart, her jaw slightly open. Thomas Gaines exhaled, a deep, long breath. Maybe it was pride, maybe relief, maybe both. Harold didn't say anything. He simply lowered his hand, locking eyes with Delaney. But the captain wasn't finished. Not yet. He stepped closer and spoke directly to Harold. "Sir, would you allow me to escort you back to your original seat?" Harold hesitated. "Back to 12B?" Delaney nodded. "That's where you were assigned. That's where you belong." Harold's voice was low, barely audible. I don't want to cause any trouble, son. I've had enough of that in my life. Delaney's expression softened. Not quite a smile, but something close. You're not causing trouble. You're correcting a mistake, and I'm here to make sure it stays corrected. Another pause. Then slowly Harold stood. It wasn't out of hesitation, just age. The woman beside him slid out of the way, watching like she was witnessing something sacred. Delaney didn't rush him. He simply turned and began walking beside him, back down the aisle. The two men moved slowly, one in a clean-pressed pilot's uniform, the other in a brown cardigan and worn shoes. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Passengers leaned into the aisle as they passed. Some clapped again. Some simply nodded. A man in business class quietly closed his laptop for the first time that flight. When they reached row 12, the suited man still occupying the seat looked up, clearly annoyed. Delaney didn't flinch. "Sir," he said plainly, "this seat is no longer yours." The man raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. This seat belongs to Mr. Merriweather. You were not assigned here. You'll need to move." The man scoffed, glancing around. "Is this some kind of joke? I paid for this seat." Delaney didn't raise his voice. "I'm not going to debate you in front of the entire cabin. You can move voluntarily, or I can request ground security to meet us when we land." Silence. The man looked around again, realizing how many people were watching. Then reluctantly, he stood, grabbed his things, and moved down the aisle, eyes avoiding everyone. Delaney gestured toward the seat. "Please, sir." Harold sat slowly. He looked around, then back at the captain. "Thank you," he said, his voice a little rough. Delaney gave a respectful nod. "Welcome back, Mr. Merriweather." Then he turned, walked back up the aisle, and returned to the cockpit. No fanfare, no further announcement. Just a man who knew the value of honoring another. And the rest of the flight? It was quiet, not out of awkwardness, but reverence. No one would forget what happened at 34,000 feet that day. The man in 12B didn't argue again. He just muttered under his breath, grabbed his briefcase, and stomped down the aisle, his pride trailing behind him like carry-on baggage. None of the flight attendants offered to help this time. Captain Delaney turned to Harold and gestured toward the seat. "It's yours again." Harold nodded once and sat down, composed as ever. But what happened next caught the entire cabin off guard. Delaney sat down too, right in the middle seat beside him. A soft wave of whispers passed through the plane. "You don't have to do that, son," Harold said quietly. "I want to," Delaney replied with a real smile this time. And just like that, the captain stayed. For the rest of the flight, he sat in that middle seat, answering questions from curious passengers, posing for a photo with a kid in 13C, and even handing Harold a ginger ale with a wink. On the house, back in row 31, the toddler was finally asleep. The cabin, once tense, now felt lighter, like something unspoken had been lifted. Thomas Gaines leaned back in his seat, watching Harold sip his drink, settled at last where he belonged. In row 15D, a teenage girl quietly sketched a scene. Just a quick doodle of the two men side by side, one in uniform, the other in civilian clothes with silver hair and a quiet presence. It wasn't a grand gesture, but she'd remember it. They all would. But beneath the calm, there was a truth beginning to surface. What most of the passengers didn't yet know, what only a few crew members had begun to whisper, was why Harold had been moved in the first place. And when that truth came out, it would stain more than just reputations. The cabin had changed, not just in tone, but in how people looked at one another. There were fewer eyes on screens now, fewer page flips. Instead, eyes drifted toward row 12, where a retired soldier and a captain now sat shoulder to shoulder, not as a performance, but as a quiet protest against how things had been allowed to go wrong. In 12A, the girl who'd been silent all flight finally glanced up from her phone. She turned toward Harold, hesitating. "Sir, were you really in Vietnam?" Harold turned, a little surprised. "Yes, ma'am. Long time ago now." "Did you really save people? In that fire?" He gave a tired smile. "I just did what anyone would have. We were in a bad spot. You don't think in those moments. You just move." She nodded, chewing her lip. Then, without saying another word, she reached into her backpack, pulled out a chocolate chip cookie wrapped in a napkin, and handed it to him. For your great-grandkid, she said softly, or just for you. Harold accepted it like it was a medal. Across the aisle, Thomas caught the moment and smiled without meaning to. Further back, murmurs had begun. Why was he moved? Did someone complain? That's not right. The whispers weren't loud, but they carried, and the crew heard them too. In the galley, the younger flight attendant, the one with the tight ponytail, stood rigid. She hadn't spoken since the salute. Denise Langley, the veteran attendant with 28 years under her belt, stepped beside her. You need to tell the captain. I didn't do anything wrong, the younger woman muttered. You bypassed seat assignment protocol, Denise said calmly. And you know it. I was told it was fine. No, you told the desk crew to log it as a mix-up. I heard you. The younger attendant didn't answer, but just then, a cough from behind the curtain warned them. Captain Delaney was headed their way. Denise stepped out to meet him first. Alyssa, he said, eyes on the younger woman. Got a second? She nodded and moved aside. Delaney didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. I just want to understand how a confirmed seat for a military veteran with early boarding status got changed without his knowledge. It wasn't supposed to be personal, Alyssa said. The guy in 12B is one of our platinum tier flyers. He didn't want to sit next to that man. You mean Harold? Delaney said flatly. She looked down. You gave away a rightful seat to someone who followed the rules, who never complained, because it made someone else more comfortable? She hesitated, then nodded. Delaney's voice dropped lower. When I was 26, I flew missions over Basra. We ran out of fuel mid-route and had to land in hostile territory. My wingman didn't make it. The man who pulled me out of that wreck was black. He carried me half a mile, bleeding from his shoulder. That man wasn't a mix-up. Alyssa blinked hard. She didn't respond. When we land, Delaney said, you'll be writing a report. I'll be filing mine too. This can't happen again. Not today. Not ever. And with that, he turned and left her standing there. On his way back, he paused by row 14. Thomas, right? The man blinked. Yeah, that's me. Thanks. For noticing. For speaking up. Thomas shrugged. Didn't feel like I had much choice. You did, Delaney replied. And you made the right one. In row 12, Harold sat quietly, folding the napkin that held the cookie into a perfect little square. He didn't know what had just unfolded in the galley. He didn't need to. The change in the air told him everything. People looked at him differently now, not with pity, but with a reverence usually reserved for memorials or folded flags. But Harold hadn't flown today to be honored. He'd flown to meet someone, and that moment was almost here. The cabin lights dimmed. Delaney's voice returned over the intercom. Folks, we've begun our descent into Colorado Springs. Please return to your seats, fasten your belts, and secure all items. Routine words, but nothing about this descent felt routine. Row 12 had gone silent. Harold leaned back, the cookie untouched, resting in his lap. He hadn't said much since the crowd quieted, but the weight of the past hour sat heavy, not as a burden, but as something sacred. Up front, Captain Delaney guided the plane like any other day, but something in his voice had changed. He wasn't just flying them to a destination, he was delivering a message. Thomas glanced at Harold. The moment was slipping away, and he didn't want to let it. He leaned slightly into the aisle. Sir, he said gently, I just wanted to say, I saw what they did. That wasn't right. Harold turned slowly, looking at him, really looking. Harold's expression remained calm, unreadable, as Thomas sat beside him, voice soft. I almost said something earlier, but I didn't. He paused, guilt flickering across his face. Not at first, anyway. I won't forget how you handled that. The way you carried yourself, it was grace, the kind I'm not sure I could have managed. Harold studied him a moment, then quietly, but you did speak up. That's more than most. Thomas nodded, swallowing hard. You headed to see family? Harold's gaze softened. My great-grandson. First time meeting him. Across the aisle, a woman leaned over. Well, he's lucky to have you. We all saw what happened today. Harold offered the faintest smile. I hope he grows up in a world where we don't have to keep learning the same lessons. As the plane began to descend, More passengers made their way over, some hesitant, some heartfelt. A mother with two young boys stopped by during the final taxi. "My dad served in Vietnam too," she said. "He never talked about it. I wish he'd lived long enough to see someone be honored like that." Harold gently shook her hand. He saw enough to know he was part of something bigger. Even the teenage girl from seat 12A came by, fidgeting awkwardly. "If my dad had seen what happened, he'd have done something too. I'm going to tell him about you." Her words weren't perfect, but they were honest, and Harold appreciated them more than anyone realized. When the wheels touched down and the plane came to a stop, something unusual happened. The seatbelt sign went off, but no one moved. No one rushed to grab their bags. They waited, out of respect. Harold stood slowly, and as he made his way down the aisle, the captain emerged once more, this time holding a folded piece of paper. "Mr. Merriweather, one last thing," Captain Delaney said. Harold looked up. "This is a contact at our Veterans Partnership Division," Delaney explained, handing him the note. "They'd like to talk with you about sharing your story, on your terms if you're open to it." Harold took the paper, silent for a moment. "Stories like yours matter," Delaney added. "I'm just one man," Harold replied. "Exactly," Delaney said. "One man made everyone rethink how they act. I saw it today." Passengers were still seated, watching. Thomas gave a small wave from his seat. Harold tipped his cap. "Thank you, Captain." Delaney gripped his hand firmly. "No, sir. Thank you." As Harold stepped onto the jet bridge and disappeared into the terminal, his walk was steady, unhurried but full of quiet strength. Back on the plane, passengers slowly began to rise, still processing. Some had filmed the salute, others hadn't. But everyone had felt it. Harold's journey wasn't quite over, because just past baggage claim, through the crowd and noise of Gate B7, was the very reason he'd taken this flight. The terminal buzzed with the usual chaos. Blinking screens, rolling suitcases, overhead announcements. But Harold barely noticed. One hand clutched the letter the captain had given him. The other held a small stuffed elephant, something he'd picked up from the airport gift shop. Just a little gift for a life that was only beginning. Then he saw her, Rhonda, mid-30s, navy hoodie, hair pulled back. In one arm, she cradled a baby carrier. With the other, she waved. "Papa," she called, her eyes already wet. For the first time all day, Harold smiled without holding back. He moved as fast as his legs would allow. Rhonda met him halfway, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. "You made it," she whispered. "You doubted me?" She laughed through her tears. "Never." She held up the carrier. "Meet Miles." Harold leaned down, eyes scanning the tiny face nestled in soft blankets, and something caught in his chest. Not pride, not even joy. Something heavier. Because looking at that baby, Harold didn't just see his great-grandson. He saw a chance for things to be different, a chance for that little boy to grow up in a world where no one would ever be asked to move just to make someone else feel comfortable. Harold tucked the stuffed elephant gently beside the baby's hand and whispered, "You don't know it yet, little man, but this world's got work to do, and you're going to help it just by being you." Rhonda wiped her cheek. "You okay, Papa?" Harold straightened up. "Yeah, just thinking about what I'll want to tell him when he's older." "You'll have time," she said. "You're going to be part of everything. First steps, first words, all of it." They sat for a while at the baggage carousel. Rhonda handed him a homemade sandwich, turkey with a little mustard, just the way he liked it. They didn't speak much. There wasn't a need. Eventually she asked, "Was the flight all right?" Harold chuckled softly. "Let's just say it had a few surprises." She raised an eyebrow. "You look tired." "I'm fine," he paused. "Something happened on that plane I didn't expect." Concern flickered in her eyes, but Harold waved it off. "It turned out okay. Some folks did the right thing. That's what matters." Rhonda studied him. She sensed there was more, but she didn't push. Instead, she rested her hand on his. "You've always had that effect on people," she said. "Make them want to do better." He looked at her, narrowing his eyes playfully. "You saying I guilted the world into having a conscience?" She laughed. "Number, I'm saying they looked at you and remembered what decency looks like." Their bags came through. Rhonda got up to grab them. Harold stayed seated a moment longer, letting the moment stretch. He glanced down at Miles, now sleeping soundly. In that tiny face, Harold saw something he couldn't quite name. A hope, an anchor, a future that just might be better than the past. But he also knew the lesson wasn't finished, because some things still needed to be said. 3 days later, the airline released a short statement. We are reviewing an incident on Flight 2228 involving a seating issue and are committed to ensuring all passengers are treated with dignity and fairness. That was it. No names. No mention of a veteran. No acknowledgement of the captain who left the cockpit to make it right. But Harold didn't need a press release. That flight wasn't about headlines. It was about how silence speaks volumes and how one act of courage can ripple through a crowd of bystanders. He didn't need a thank you. He got it when a little girl gave him a cookie, when the captain saluted, when Thomas stood up and said, "That's not right." At home, Harold sat on his porch in his favorite chair, rocking gently as the sun sank low. The letter from Delaney rested in his coat pocket. Beside him, a framed photo of Rhonda and baby Miles. Harold leaned down, eyes scanning the tiny face nestled in soft blankets. And something caught in his chest. Not pride, not even joy, something heavier. Because looking at that baby, Harold didn't just see his great-grandson. He saw a chance for things to be different, a chance for that little boy to grow up in a world where no one would ever be asked to move just to make someone else feel comfortable. Harold tucked the stuffed elephant gently beside the baby's hand and whispered, "You don't know it yet, little man, but this world's got work to do, and you're going to help it just by being you." Rhonda wiped her cheek. "You okay, Papa?" Harold straightened up. "Yeah, just thinking about what I'll want to tell him when he's older." "You'll have time," she said. "You're going to be part of everything. First steps, first words, all of it." They sat for a while at the baggage carousel. Rhonda handed him a homemade sandwich, turkey with a little mustard, just the way he liked it. They didn't speak much. There wasn't a need. Eventually she asked, "Was the flight all right?" Harold chuckled softly. "Let's just say it had a few surprises." She raised an eyebrow. "You look tired." "I'm fine," he paused. "Something happened on that plane I didn't expect." Concern flickered in her eyes, but Harold waved it off. "It turned out okay. Some folks did the right thing. That's what matters." Rhonda studied him. She sensed there was more, but she didn't push. Instead, she rested her hand on his. "You've always had that effect on people," she said. "Make them want to do better." He looked at her, narrowing his eyes playfully. "You saying I guilted the world into having a conscience?" She laughed. I'm saying." They looked at you and remembered what decency looks like. Their bags came through. Rhonda got up to grab them. Harold stayed seated a moment longer, letting the moment stretch. He glanced down at Miles, now sleeping soundly. In that tiny face, Harold saw something he couldn't quite name. A hope, an anchor, a future that just might be better than the past. But he also knew the lesson wasn't finished, because some things still needed to be said. 3 days later, the airline released a short statement. We are reviewing an incident on Flight 2228 involving a seating issue and are committed to ensuring all passengers are treated with dignity and fairness. That was it. No names, no mention of a veteran, no acknowledgement of the captain who left the cockpit to make it right. But Harold didn't need a press release. That flight wasn't about headlines. It was about how silence speaks volumes and how one act of courage can ripple through a crowd of bystanders. He didn't need a thank you. He got it when a little girl gave him a cookie, when the captain saluted, when Thomas stood up and said, "That's not right." At home, Harold sat on his porch in his favorite chair, rocking gently as the sun sank low. The letter from Delaney rested in his coat pocket. Beside him, a framed photo of Rhonda and baby Miles. He didn't replay the incident. He didn't stew or grow bitter. He just thought about what happened after someone found the courage to stand up. It only took one. And he thought about the man who didn't want to sit next to an old black veteran. That man had vanished down the aisle like smoke. No words, no glance back. Harold didn't feel angry anymore. Just pity. That man could have left with a story about grace and honor and what it means to grow. Instead, he walked away smaller than he came. Later that week, Thomas sent Harold a photo taken by another passenger. Harold standing in row 31, the captain saluting, every eye watching. Beneath it, Thomas had written just 2 words. Changed me. Harold smiled. That's the thing about dignity. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't need to shout. It just stands still long enough for people to recognize it. That's what Harold wanted for his great-grandson. Not medals or parades, just the instinct to do the right thing, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. As the sun slipped behind the trees, Harold leaned back and closed his eyes. And in his mind, he could still hear Captain Delaney's words echo through the cabin. That man should sit wherever he damn well pleases. It was never about the seat. It was about being seen, about being counted, about being human. So if you ever find yourself in a moment where it's easier to stay quiet, remember Flight 2228. Remember the aisle. Remember the salute. Be the one who doesn't wait for permission to do what's right. And if this story made you pause, made you feel something, or reminded you of someone you love, hit subscribe. Because we need more stories that remind us what we owe to each other, even 30,000 feet in the air.